Good morning, everyone. After a successful round of speaker sessions in the TRBS speaker series in the morning, we come with another extremely intriguing session by Mr. Niki Frank. He is the CEO of DHL Global Forwarding South Asia. He oversees the freight forwarders operations in the South Asian sub-region, which comprises of Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. He earlier worked with the Boston Consulting Group and holds a master's degree from the University of Maastricht. Thank you so much, sir, for gracing us with your esteemed presence. Now, before starting the session, let's watch a video.
Yeah, thank you, Adia, for the warm welcome, and good morning, good afternoon to all of you. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, and thank you to IIMA for the invitation to the Red Brick Summit. It's an honor to have the opportunity to speak to you this morning about the power of logistics. I hope you could already get some impressions and see some images of what we mean by the power of logistics. Before we get into this, maybe just if you switch to the next slide, a very brief introduction about myself. I started my career actually not in logistics, but in banking. I worked for Deutsche Bank. And then after studying economics in the Netherlands and in Argentina, I joined the Boston Consulting Group, worked there for about 8 years as a management consultant before finally finding my way into logistics and into Deutsche Post DHL Group. I held different positions there so far. I joined them in 2012 as the head of corporate strategy for the Deutsche Post DHL Group. In 2014, I then joined one of the business units, DHL Global Forwarding, became a part of the global management board there, also being responsible for the global business strategy, as well as the global training and engagement programs. And since 2019, I'm in India, based out of Mumbai, being responsible for our businesses here in India and the subcontinent. It's a pleasure to meet you today. And what am I going to talk to you today about? If we move to the next slide, please. Just want to give you a very brief introduction into who we are as Deutsche Post DHL Group, the world's largest logistic group, and then talk about the power of logistics. And I'm looking at that from two perspectives. On the one hand, the longer term trends affecting the logistics industry, how they change the logistics industry, and also what we as DHL do to incorporate them into our business. And secondly, I want to focus a bit more about the more current situation and the last 12 to 18 months and talk a bit about the role of logistics during the pandemic. And I want to close it with some thoughts about what that could possibly mean for you and your future. So if we move on, who are we as DHL? If you click once more, or actually twice. So we are a logistics company, and in fact, we are the world's largest logistics company. Looking at it, from a very simple perspective, we move stuff from A to B. We get things transported from one point to another. But there's a lot more than that, what we do. We are the world's largest logistics company, working on the ground with road transportation, in the air with air freight and express services, ocean freight services, but also with warehousing and supply chain solutions. We are the largest logistics player, and we have a very long heritage. If you move to the next slide, actually our heritage started with Deutsche Post, which is the equivalent to the Indian Post. Deutsche Post has a heritage of nearly 600 years. It goes back to a time when letters were still transported with horse carriages. Obviously, this is a very long time ago, and the real, I would say, exciting history of the company started in the early 1990s, when the former government-owned Deutsche Post was first privatized and then also IPO'd. And the management at the time had a very bold vision to create the world leader in logistics. So from a postal company that was focused on transporting letters within Germany and internationally, the company went on an acquisition tour of more than 100 companies over a couple of years, the largest ones actually forming the basis of the company today. So the Deutsche Post DHL group consists of 5 business units. We have this post and parcel business in Germany, which is, as I mentioned, the equivalent to the post. So looking after distribution of letters and parcels. We have a division, DHL Express, you might have heard of. This is the world's largest courier company, basically looking after time-sensitive, time-critical shipments across the world, typically smaller packages and parcels or letters. With the DHL Global Freight Forwarding, that's the division I'm looking after here in the subcontinent, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. We have DHL Supply Chain, that's our contract logistics division. So these are the colleagues who take care of managing warehouses for our customers, including local distribution and transportation. And the youngest addition in our family, which is just a couple of years old, is our DHL e-commerce solutions division, which caters to the trend of e-commerce, providing cross-border as well as domestic e-commerce solutions. So from local pickup to final delivery to customers. Our strategy can be summarized in basically 3 taglines. We strive to be the employer of choice, the provider of choice for our customers, as well as the investment of choice for our investors. And I won't take you through the whole strategy, as that would probably be a separate session. But if we look at the next slide, it's underpinning what we believe in as our fundamental principle and also as the purpose of our company. Our company's purpose since nearly 2 decades has been connecting people, improving lives. And to be very honest with you, it's always been a communication challenge in many years to communicate that not just to our customers and our partners, but also to our own employees, to make it meaningful to them what their day-to-day job means and what we imply by connecting people, improving lives. But since the last 18 months, since the beginning of this pandemic, I think this has become extremely evident, and logistics has taken center stage of many mainstream media articles, of many discussions, because suddenly everybody realizes that without logistics, nothing works, and logistics is part of every other industry, because everything you wear today, everything you use for your daily life, all the food that you're eating, essentially logistics is a critical part in that and is involved in all of these other industries. And as a company, we fundamentally believe in global trade and in the future of global trade, because we have seen this over the last decades, that the benefits of global trade leading to more prosperity, to more wealth, and also to better living conditions for people across the world. And we are there to support that trade really not just moving stuff from A to B, but helping companies of all sizes, from small to multinational companies, bringing their products to the end consumers, helping them to manage their warehouses, helping them to manage their local distribution, and ultimately to customers, getting the goods that they order online to them in time and in quality. So if you move one slide further, just bringing it down to DHL Global Forwarding India, the business I know best and which I'm responsible for. We are part of that unique global portfolio of the world's largest logistics company. So I said we are, being a former state-run monopoly, we are the largest mail and parcel provider in Germany. We are the #1 international express company, courier company. We are the #1 in contract logistics, and we're also the world's largest freight forwarding organization. So thinking back to that initiation of the company, that bold vision of the leadership in the early 1990s, it's really a tremendous achievement and a great story. Actually would make a nice case study to see how a bold vision coupled with strong execution excellence can actually lead to such a strong development. Just as a last slide on who we are, on the next slide, DHL Global Forwarding India, just to put that a little bit into perspective. We are the largest multinational freight forwarder. We ship around more than 100,000 tons of air freight, imports and exports into the country across all kinds of sectors, from life science and healthcare to automotive, engineering, manufacturing, technology, consumer and retail, you name it. We transport more than 115,000 standard ocean freight containers and more than 200,000 cubic meters of less than container load ocean freight cargo. We're also one of the very few multinational freight forwarders with our own customs clearance license. We are AEO Tier 2 certified, and we clear more than 130,000 files for our customers every year. From a footprint perspective, we cover essentially the entire country with 28 offices and stations, where we're based in all of the major airports and seaports, as well as all the larger metros, with our own operation staff. And as one unique feature in the industry, we are the only freight forwarder who is certified both as a great place to work for 4 consecutive years now, and as a top employer, which is testament to the more than 1,000 highly motivated people that we have. So that much just as a brief introduction into DHL and DHL Global Forwarding India. Now, if we move to the next slide, I want to talk a bit about the trends affecting the logistics industry and how we at DHL look at those trends and work with those trends. So if you move one slide further, please. We have a very comprehensive process in the group, and I'm well into that, as I was responsible for the corporate strategy in my first role in the company. So part of our regular strategy exercise is to look at the trends that are out there and distill those into the ones that are most relevant for logistics and that might have the biggest impact. We have a very comprehensive process there. We publish every second year an update of our trend radar that really looks at the entire globe of trends that are identified and that are upcoming and that are developing over time. We assess these trends along different dimensions. For example, how mature the trend is and how, in which time frame it might actually have an impact on the logistics industry, and how relevant that impact is. And when we find trends that are getting into a range of 3 to 5 years of becoming mature and having a high impact on the logistics industry, we then start to work with startups, with research institutes, with universities, with other partners to develop use cases and build prototypes. And then based on these prototypes and their success, we ultimately transform them or hand them over into our different business units to bring them into our business. And I'll give you a couple of examples of those in a few minutes. From our current strategy 2025, the 4 key trends that we have identified and that actually have remained constant also since our strategy 2020 are globalization, e-commerce, digitalization, and sustainability. I think globalization doesn't require much of an explanation. Maybe just one or a few sentences here. As we are reading, especially since the last 12 months and the beginning of the pandemic, a lot about the end of globalization, the revival of nearshoring, bestshoring, reshoring, more nationalism instead of globalization. We truly believe in globalization, and we also don't think it's going to end. Yes, there are sometimes counter tendencies, some countries imposing higher trade barriers or tariffs and putting some sand into the wheels of globalization. But ultimately, we believe in the benefits of globalization, and we also believe that the customers decide about globalization, and customers typically want the best products at the lowest price. And this requires globalization. This requires production in cheaper locations. This requires logistics to take care of the supply chains. And we truly believe that also globalization will be there going forward. E-commerce, I think, is something that in your generation, I don't have to explain, and I don't need to talk too much about it. I'm sure many of you order a lot of the goods that you consume, the goods that you need online. E-commerce, when I look back at our strategy 2025, e-commerce was a fundamental driving force and continues to be, but nobody has anticipated how the pandemic would accelerate e-commerce. The plans that basically all of the companies being active in the field of e-commerce, including logistics players like us, had, those plans were looking at the next 5 or 10 years of e-commerce. And a large chunk of that development has happened in the last 12 months. So the pace at which e-commerce has taken off and has already shaped many industries, including logistics, has tremendously accelerated over the last 12 months. Now, today I want to dig a little bit deeper into digitalization and sustainability. So if you move to the next slide on digitalization, just to give you a status quo or somewhat a depiction of how the logistics industry looks today, it is by and large still a very paper-based industry. So a lot of the documents that are exchanged between airlines, shipping lines, freight forwarders, customers are paper-based. I can tell you from own experience also here in India, even though there are areas where India has leapfrogged and is very digital already, when it comes to logistics, it still is not. We managed during the pandemic, during lockdowns, to convince customers to accept digitally signed invoices or digitally signed documents, just as an example. But the moment the lockdowns were lifted and people could travel around again and move around again, many of the customers came back and required physical hard copies of invoices. So it is a constant battle, I would say, and it requires a lot of convincing and arguments to convince customers that digitally signed documents are equally relevant and equally, secure as a paper-based and stamped hard copy. Also, if you look into the physical operations in logistics, more than 80% of those are still manual. So if you look into warehouses, if you look into container freight stations or into cargo terminals, a lot of the movements there are still manual and not automated. And likewise, if you visited logistics department in companies, if you visit logistics players' offices, you would still find fax machines being around. When we speak to customers and also when we look at our own industry, only very few companies have really started to take digitalization seriously and adopt it and make it part of their strategy, like we have done at DHL. So let me move to a few use cases or show you a few examples how we've incorporated that on the next slide. As I mentioned, we have this very comprehensive process of identifying trends, then looking at use cases and building prototypes to ultimately translating them into our day-to-day business. Augmented reality is one such trend and technology. Looking back some 5-6 years, some of you might remember the breaking news announcement of Google that they came out with Google Glass. So that was already at a time when we had identified augmented reality as a relevant and impactful trend to logistics. And at the time, we already were working with companies and corporate partners to prototype and test the usage of virtual glasses in our warehouses. So what they are used for is the person who moves along the aisles to pick certain goods. Like if you shop on Amazon or on Flipkart or on other platforms, that your shopping order typically translates into a picking list for someone in a warehouse who moves along the bins and the shelves to pick those goods that you ordered to put them into your package. And with the usage of vision picking and smart glasses, the pickers get the image of which bin they have to go to, how many pieces they have to take out, and it also detects whether these are the right pieces or not, whether it's the right size, the right color, etc. So through the usage of this vision picking and the inclusion of smart glasses, the picking accuracy increases tremendously, and also the efficiency increases. And by now, this is a standard accessory that we are using in our warehouses at DHL. Likewise, if you look at robotics and automation, that's also a trend that we identified a couple of years ago, and through the development of prototypes and pilots, we now have already across the globe numerous warehouses which are completely automated. So you hardly see human workers in these warehouses, but you see fleets of robots autonomously driving around the warehouses in different forms. You have collaborative models where the robots bring the bins and the goods to the picker, who then stands at one location rather than going around the warehouse, going from shelf to shelf. The robots basically bring the parts that are needed to the picker. He just takes it from the robot and puts it in the parcel. We also have other collaborative robots where lifting heavyweight cargo or loading and unloading trucks is supported by robots. And just to give you another example on Internet of Things, which is a trend that's also there since a while and that has been identified a couple of years ago, and low-cost sensors. So today, whether you look at RFID chips or other forms of low-cost sensors, are applied in many applications. We use them within the company, for example, for asset tracking and monitoring. So our material handling equipment, our forklifts, and other equipments, we use them to locate them as well as to monitor their status, the battery power, the wear and tear, etc. But we also use Internet of Things and these low-cost sensors for external applications, for example, by securing ocean freight containers for customers. We have innovated secure lock, which not only tracks any opening of the container, but it also tracks the location of the container. It can detect shocks, it can detect light, it can detect or it can measure the temperature. So, for example, recently, over the last 12 to 18 months, when it came to the movement of COVID-19 vaccines, this is an essential technology that's been applied to these movements, as most of the vaccines have to be moved in a temperature-controlled environment at either 2 to 8 degrees or minus 20 degrees, depending on the vaccine. And the temperature has to be monitored throughout the entire transportation, from the moment it leaves the factory to the moment it reaches basically the hospital. And these low-cost sensors constantly track the data and submit it digitally also to a control tower who monitors the condition of these shipments. These are just a couple of examples how we look at trends in the logistics industry and at DHL and how we incorporate them into our business. Let me shift on the next slide to the second trend there, which is sustainability. I hope that for your generation, you are much more aware about the need for sustainable operations and the risks of global warming and exploiting the planet than probably your parents or your grandparents have been. And why is this important for logistics? Well, logistics is one of the largest sources of emissions if you look at it from an industry perspective. The entire transportation industry, from the airlines to the shipping lines to also all the trucks that are deployed worldwide, contributes significantly to the CO2 emissions, and thereby to the negative aspects of global warming, like rising sea levels, natural disasters, scarcity of water, etc. So we at DHL take this very seriously and have made this an essential part of our strategy. And if you move one slide, just to show you the sustainability is not just a trend, but it's an essential element of our corporate strategy. And we have committed already a few years back to net zero emissions by the year 2050. And we further specified this with interim targets by 2030 and investment commitments up to 7 billion over the next 8 years. And just to mention a couple of areas that we do, well, it typically starts with creating transparency. So we provide our customers with reports, with analysis about their carbon footprint, and also with suggestions or programs how to optimize their carbon footprint. In our own operations, we look at entirely carbon neutral buildings. So all new facilities that we construct, all new offices that we build have to follow a rigid process to ensure that we leverage green electricity and that we use photovoltaic or solar panels, green electricity, etc. When we look at our trucking operations, we use also sustainable fuels. We use electric trucks. Likewise, in airline or in air freight, we've recently piloted the usage of sustainable aviation fuels, which we use both for our own planes as well as working with partners for commercial airline movements. Similarly, on the ocean freight side, already a little bit longer, we have introduced the usage of sustainable marine fuels, and we are offsetting the emissions free of charge for our customers for all less than container load shipments. And we offer customers also solutions to offset their emissions for their full container load shipments. And we also use a lot of technology, for example, to optimize the routing of our delivery vehicles, of the courier vehicles or the parcel vehicles, to identify how can they optimize the route with all their parcels, that they burn less fuel, that they use the engine less time, that they take the quickest route and avoid traffic jams. And obviously an essential part of that is electrifying our delivery vehicle fleet, where we've committed to 70% electric vehicles by the year 2030. So again, as said, just to highlight some of the applications of trends and how we incorporate them into our business, and also showing you how we use modern technologies in the logistics industry, which is in dire need of being modernized, being digitized, and being automated. Let me shift on the next slide now to the role of logistics during the pandemic, and why also here the power of logistics has become very evident, or still is very evident. On the next slide, I just give you a summary of what do freight markets look like. And if you talk to people in the industry, either colleagues of mine, or if you talk to logistics departments in larger companies, and if you talk to people who are slightly more gray-haired than me, who have been around for 30, 40 years, all of them would say that they have never experienced a situation like today. We have capacity constraints in all modes of transportation, be it ocean freight, air freight, rail freight, trucking. There's equipment shortages at ports and especially in hinterland locations. We have congestions at all major seaports and airports. There are more than 100 container vessels now waiting outside of the West Coast ports of the US at Los Angeles and Long Beach to actually get into the ports to offload their cargo. And that all has led to unprecedented freight rates. So just to give you a comparison, you would be able 2-3 years ago to ship a container from Asia to the US or to Europe for $1,000 to $1,500. These days, the highest quotations that I've seen went up to $40,000. That is a magnification or an increase of freight rates that has never been there in history. And that all coupled with significantly lower schedule reliability and service levels by the carriers. So ocean freight carriers, for example, used to have a schedule reliability around the 90%. That means 90% of the vessels arrive on time during the scheduled date and time, whereas now that has gone down to below 30%. So this all has led to supply chain disruptions. And on the next slide, just to illustrate where this is coming from, well, this is coming from a strong imbalance between supply and demand. What you see on the top half of the slide is the ocean freight market capacity development since 2015. The orange line is the demand development, and the dark line is the supply development. And you see that through the last couple of years, we've been always in a situation where supply was outpacing demand. This has led to overcapacities in the industry and to price wars between the ocean freight carriers and to dumping of the freight rates. And then you could get these $500 or $1,000 container moves from Asia to Europe or from Asia to the US. Now, with the onset of the pandemic, this has completely shifted. While initially supply dropped, by now we are at a situation where supply is maxed out. All large container vessels that exist on this planet are on the oceans. There's nothing in terms of idle capacity that could be activated. But at the same time, demand has increased tremendously and is now outgrowing supply. And all of you who have taken Economics 101 courses would know that in a situation where demand outpaces supply significantly, prices increase, and that is what we're seeing in the market. You see a similar picture from the beginning of the pandemic to May this year in the air freight market at the bottom. Also, you see the red line, which represents air freight capacity, drops significantly with the beginning of the pandemic, with basically the grounding of passenger aircrafts and the stop of international passenger movements. Whereas supply initially dropped, it has continuously recovered, and especially since the beginning of this year, when the US came out of their lockdowns and their COVID restrictions, when Europe has started to recover, and when China and some Asian countries have started to recover, you see a widening gap of the demand versus supply. And also in the air freight market, that follows the usual market mechanisms, meaning higher freight rates. If we move one slide further, I'd just briefly like to deep dive into where that demand growth is coming from. And you see on the left-hand side, the development in terms of demand and supply. And on the right-hand side graph, you see especially on the Trans-Pacific, so that is between Asia and the US, where that increased demand is coming from. And that is primarily driven by consumer electronics, furnitures, and essential items. And why is that? Well, that is relatively simple to explain. Especially US consumers have received large subsidies from the government to reignite the economy, to drive economic recovery. So all of them have received checks from the government, and typical American consumer behavior is not that they would take this money and save it for other times, but they spend it. And being locked at home, restaurants being closed, travel not possible, customers have spent this on consumer electronics items. A large chunk of these items are also laptops or smartphones that were used for homeschooling, work from home, etc. And people not being able to travel, people not going out to restaurants, have leisure activities, have invested money into their homes. So they started buying more furniture and home decoration articles. So that's where you see the huge drive in demand coming from. And this is only further worsened in a situation where there's an imbalance between demand and supply, as customers are struggling to get their goods, and companies are eager to get their products into the US markets, into the stores and into the shelves. They are just driving further capacity towards that trade lane. So what does that mean on the next slide for supply chains and the logistics, if we just move one further? Yeah, so the impact to supply chains is, first of all, unpredictability. As I mentioned it with one example, schedule reliability has significantly dropped. There's lack of consistency. Airline schedules, shipping line schedules are no longer following the usual pattern. There's huge cost escalations. Customers, companies start to discuss about, should we shift our footprint? Should we shift our supplier base? Should we change the location of our factories? Should we bring them closer to home? And all of that is further increasing the unpredictability. And as I mentioned before, we expect globalization to continue. And even though companies and customers are talking now about bringing production closer to their end markets, this is a mid to long-term decision for many companies, and you don't easily change a factory location, nor do you easily change your supplier base and overnight find additional high-quality suppliers. So that situation is there to stay for some time until we will actually see an improvement. Now, on the next slide, it's not all doom and gloom because logistics has a center role to play, and there's actually a lot that companies like DHL are doing to help overcome these challenges. For example, through innovative transport solutions or alternate transport modes. Just also to give you one example here or two, throughout the pandemic, throughout the lockdown, we've chartered a massive amount of flights, not just here in India, but across Asia Pacific and the world overall, to evacuate some of that cargo that is stuck, to also make sure that customers, receive their laptops that they need for their kids' homeschooling, that companies receive the laptops that they need to enable their employees to work from home. An example of all alternate transport modes are sea-air solutions or air-sea solutions. So usually you would ship goods like home furniture, you would ship them via ocean freight from India into the US. But if you urgently or more urgently need that goods, but you don't want to ship all of it with air freight, we've been looking at transport combinations. So we, for example, flown some of that cargo from India into Dubai, and then out of Dubai, where the port was less congested, where there was more capacity, then put it on an ocean freight container and shipped it to the US. I mentioned shift of production or logistics footprint, and other areas that logistics plays an essential role in is creating higher visibility and planning accuracy, and also doing data-driven analytics, predictive analytics to really help customers understand what's going to happen to their goods, what's going to happen to their supply chains before it actually happens. So using technologies like AI, using data analytics, using natural language processing to help customers improve the efficiency and the automation of their supply chain and help them get into more predictive modes. That is also, I think, if we move to the next slides, where this might start to become interesting for you. If you click one slide further, I just briefly like to wrap this up by highlighting how we are working with our people, how we are working with our employees. So one important aspect that also makes us a great place to work and a top employer is that we constantly help to develop and train our employees. That starts through a massive online portal that covers hundreds of e-learning courses across different dimensions, from finance basics to air freight or ocean freight basics, up to topic like compliance or supplier codes of conduct. Obviously, the biggest part is on-the-job training, where we follow a philosophy of 10-20-70. We say 10% of the learning should happen through courses and specific trainings, 20% should happen through stretch assignments and additional tasks, and 70% happens through on-the-job training with regular coaching from the managers. There are also opportunities for international assignments. We are the most global company in the logistics world, being present in over 220 countries. So there's essentially not a single country. If you wanted to move within DHL and if you wanted to work in another country, we are there in every country. We do encourage job rotations and job transfers between divisions, and also further education. And just to give you one example, I have one of my team members here in India who's currently doing his executive MBA at the Berlin School of Management. in Germany. So that is a course that's also funded and supported by the company, where we invest in the further development in education of our employees. If you click one slide further, obviously, we consider ourselves as a very diverse company and an inclusive company, and careers are manifold, and there's not a single blueprint for a career within DHL. We have multiple divisions. We have a lot of functions, from operations to sales to marketing to other support functions, be it finance, IT, HR. We offer opportunities in all fields, and specifically in India, we offer entrance career opportunities as management trainees, graduate trainees, or lateral hires if the experience and the talents and the fit. If you move one further, please. That's just the hygiene points. We do compensate our employees in a fair and equitable manner, having them participate also in the success of the company, and offering a lot of additional benefits like flexible working hours, educational assistance programs, as I mentioned, with one example of funding an executive MBA, but also employee assistance and welfare programs, including health insurances and other things. If you click one more. So to sum it up, we always look for great talents, inspiring and motivated employees who have a can-do attitude, who like challenges, especially when looking at new technologies, how to incorporate new technologies and trends into our work, and people who also can identify themselves with our company's purpose of connecting people and improving lives. So if you click once more, if this sounds interesting to you, if that resonates with you, please don't hesitate. Either reach out to me, drop me an email, or contact me on LinkedIn, or just visit our job page at dhl.jobs. And I'm sure there might be interesting career opportunities for you here as well. So with that, thank you very much for listening to me, and happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Mr. Frank, for your extremely insightful talk. And since we are very curious to know more, we have a few questions from you. So the first question is, it's related to your talk about the issues that cropped up during the pandemic for the logistic industry. So do you think that now the industry has been through the pandemic, it is better placed to deal with next such black swan event?
Yeah, certainly. I think every new challenge makes us grow and learn, as I think, as a company, as individuals, but also as an industry. I must say that we have learned our lessons. I think we've managed fairly well as a company, but as an industry, we could have certainly done better to be prepared. At DHL, we have very stringent business continuity plans, disaster recovery plans. So this helped in activating these plans. I think nobody really had a pandemic on the radar, but nevertheless, there are huge learnings. And I think also, if you look at aspects like digitalization, also within logistics, the pandemic has significantly accelerated the adoption. And even though I was mentioning some customers, try to revert back immediately to paper-based copies, I think as an industry at large, we are clearly moving into this direction. We also see this with customs authorities, with the government further supporting and driving digitalization, and that is certainly also due to the learnings from the last 12 to 18 months.
Thank you, sir. So our second question is, what are your views on hyper-local logistics and its scalability and sustainability?
That's a very interesting aspect, but also I would say a very competitive one. If we look at the startup scene, globally, but especially also in India, a lot of the logistics startup focus on I would say, the e-commerce field, the local distribution field, and in a way into the trucking or road freight distribution. One of the reasons for that certainly is that this is the most fragmented market. There are hundreds of thousands of players active in this market, and there are huge inefficiencies. So that's a natural field to look into from a startup perspective, coming with the use of technologies, new business models, new ideas. I think a lot of the activities we will see there will not be successful in the long term, because also it's, you need further consolidation also in that part of the industry. But yes, we will continue to see, that focus on hyper local distribution, because at the end of the day, consumers now have gotten used to it. All these people in tier 3, tier 2 cities who were formerly cut off from a lot of the products, a lot of the availabilities, they've now tasted this, and they will not let that go again. So there will be continuous demand for this, and where there is demand, there is a market and an opportunity, and customers will be served for that.
So these are all the questions that we wanted to ask from you, and thank you for answering them so well and so patiently.
Thank you very much, Adia.
Okay, so we have come to the end of an insightful session. And on the behalf of the entire TRBS team, I would like to thank you, Niki, for taking out the time to enlighten us with your experiences and knowledge. And as students who aspire to be business leaders, the learnings from the session would help us in tackling the uncertainties that we face in our careers. I would also like to thank the sponsors of TRBS 2021, our title sponsor, SBI, associate sponsor, GRT Jewelers, business partner, Perfetti Van Mel, and knowledge partner, Inside IIM. So thank you everyone for joining